The air in the Yale University Library was thick with the scent of parchment and old dust, the kind that clings to forgotten centuries. A small group of scholars stood gathered around a wooden table, their voices hushed though their excitement was electric. Before them lay a single object, delicate and yellowed with age, a map unlike any they had ever seen. It seemed to whisper from another world, drawn in faint brown ink that time itself had tried to erase. Someone had brought a lamp closer, its glow catching the shimmer of strange coastlines that shouldn't exist. The room fell silent. For a moment, it felt as though the air itself held its breath. The year was 1957. The map had just emerged from obscurity, said to have come from a long-forgotten collection of medieval manuscripts. The man who introduced it spoke in a low voice, cautious yet reverent. He called it the Vinland map. A relic, he said, that might change everything we know about the past. The parchment appeared medieval, the script Latin, and yet there, along the western edge of the known world, was something impossible. A landmass that looked suspiciously like North America. And above it, written in faded ink, one word, Vinland. The scholars leaned closer, tracing the lines with their eyes. To one side was Europe, drawn in familiar medieval form, awkward proportions, yet recognizable. To the other, Iceland and Greenland, positioned correctly enough to make sense. But beyond them lay another shape, softly outlined as though hesitant to exist. It was not the fanciful edge of the world, found on other medieval maps. It was something real, precise, deliberate. One scholar murmured, "It can't be." Another, shaking his head, whispered back, "But what if it is?" They knew what this meant. If authentic, the Vinland map would predate Columbus by nearly half a millennium. It would mean that Norse explorers, Vikings, had reached and mapped part of North America around the year 1000. It would mean that history's greatest, first discovery had already happened in the icy dawn of the Middle Ages. And suddenly, centuries of accepted truth began to tremble. The question hovered over the room like smoke. Had the Vikings really found America? The man presenting the map spoke again, his voice calm but deliberate. He explained that it had been found bound within a medieval volume, alongside texts describing Norse voyages to a distant land of wine and wild grapes. He turned the parchment gently, revealing the faint traces of ink that formed coastlines and names. The edges were rough, torn from some larger codex perhaps. The ink, too, bore signs of age, faded to brown, cracked where the parchment folded. It was beautiful and unsettling, like a ghost of knowledge that had waited centuries to be seen. Someone reached forward with gloved hands and studied the curvature of the coast labeled Vinland. Another compared it to maps of Greenland and the North Atlantic. The resemblance was undeniable. The mood shifted from curiosity to disbelief, and then to awe. For a moment, time itself seemed to blur, the 20th century dissolving into the 15th, and beyond that, into the Viking Age. The hum of the university faded away. What remained was the quiet heartbeat of discovery, pulsing through every scholar in the room. Outside, snow began to fall softly over New Haven, covering the city in white. Inside, the men and women who studied the past now found themselves staring at something that seemed to rewrite it. Some felt exhilaration, the thrill of rewriting history, of proving that the North Atlantic world had been smaller than anyone thought. Others felt dread, because if the map were real, everything that followed, the voyages, the conquests, the myths, would have to be seen in a new light. As the night deepened, the scholars dispersed in uneasy silence. Some would go on to defend the map for decades, believing it a genuine relic of Norse knowledge. Others would doubt it from the beginning, calling it too perfect, too convenient, too modern in its confidence. But in that first unveiling, the possibilities felt endless. One document had cracked open the sealed walls of history. In the quiet that followed, a librarian carefully placed the map back into its protective case. The faint scratches of ink seemed to shimmer for an instant, like waves on a dark sea. It was as if the parchment remembered more than it revealed, as if it carried whispers of voyages lost to time, of wooden ships breaking through mist, of voices in languages long forgotten calling out across unknown waters. The story of the Vinland map was only beginning, but even now it radiated power, the power of an idea too vast to contain. Perhaps it was a relic of truth, a clue that the Norse had indeed reached the New World and recorded it centuries before Columbus set sail. Or perhaps it was something else, a mirror reflecting humanity's endless hunger to believe we know where we come from. As the lamp was dimmed and the room fell into darkness, the map remained there in silence, its faint lines glowing in the last trace of light. Whether it told the truth or whispered a lie, no one could yet say. But one thing was certain: the world would never look at its maps the same way again. Long before the scholars of Yale gathered around their mysterious parchment, stories had already been told of a land far across the Western Sea, a place of wild grapes, broad meadows, and soft air unlike the icy winds of Greenland. The people who told these stories were not scientists or historians, but poets, skalds, and wanderers. Their words were carried on the breath of firelight and winter nights, woven into sagas that would outlive the men who first spoke them. In those sagas, there was a name whispered again and again: Vinland. A land of wine and wonder. A land that should not have been possible, yet somehow was. It began, they say, with one man, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, whose temper had carved him a home in Greenland after exile from Iceland. Leif grew up on tales of distant islands glimpsed beyond the edge of the known sea. To a Viking, such rumors were not madness but invitation. Their world was one of restless horizons, of wooden ships cutting through fog and ice, guided only by stars and instinct. The Norsemen of that time were not conquerors in this tale, but explorers, men and women whose courage bordered on defiance. The sea was their inheritance, the unknown their home. One summer, Leif set sail westward, following the stories told by Bjarni Herjolfsson, a merchant who had once sighted land far beyond Greenland's coast but dared not go ashore. Leif would go where Bjarni had not. His crew, hardened by Arctic storms, took to their longship and pushed into mists that blurred the edge of the world. The ocean seemed endless, silent except for the groan of timber and the rhythmic pull of oars. They slept beneath the aurora's green fire, trusting that somewhere ahead lay something more than endless water. Days stretched into weeks, and when hope began to thin, a cry rose from the bow: land. The shore they reached was gentle and strange. Grass taller than any in Greenland swayed in the wind. Trees stretched toward a sky that smelled of warmth and fruit. The sagas say they found vines heavy with grapes, and streams that ran clear and sweet. The men rejoiced, calling the place Vinland, the land of wine. They built temporary shelters, gathered timber, and explored cautiously inland. The nights were softer there, the cold more forgiving. To them, it must have felt like discovering paradise after a lifetime of hardship. Leif stayed through the turning of seasons, marking the land's features and naming its bays and rivers. The sagas tell of encounters with the native people, brief, wary exchanges that sometimes turned to violence, sometimes to quiet wonder. The Norse called them Skraelings, but behind the name was confusion, not malice. They had stepped into a world already alive with its own stories, its own history. The winds that touched their sails had carried other names for this land long before Leif gave it his own. When he returned to Greenland, Leif carried with him not riches, but a vision, proof that the Western Sea did not end in mist. He spoke of the forests, the fertile ground, the sweetness of the grapes, and soon others followed. Expeditions set out under men like Thorvald and Thorfinn Karlsefni, hoping to build settlements. But the distance, the weather, and the hostility of the unfamiliar land proved too much. The Norse who came after Leif built their houses of sod and timber, stayed for a time, and vanished again into the ocean fog. Their walls crumbled, their tools rusted, and their fires went out. Yet the story remained, passed from tongue to tongue, becoming myth as memory faded. Centuries later, Icelandic monks would write those stories down, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. To read them now is to feel time fold in on itself, the ancient rhythm of Norse storytelling preserved on pages that still smell faintly of salt and smoke. They tell of longing, courage, and the ache of distance. But most of all, they speak of a simple truth, that the Vikings had indeed found a world beyond their own. Whether they knew it as America or simply as Vinland did not matter. What mattered was that they went. The saga of Vinland became part of Norse identity, a ghostly echo of their age of exploration. Even as centuries passed and the great voyages ceased, the idea of that distant, green land lingered in their imagination. Children in Iceland heard of Leif the Lucky who found the warm shores beyond the ice. Scholars debated whether such tales were mere myth. But for every skeptic, there was another who believed. There was something irresistible about the image of wooden ships cresting Atlantic waves 1,000 years before anyone else dared. Those old sagas carried within them a peculiar balance, the warmth of hope and the chill of the unknown. They did not promise glory or conquest. Instead, they whispered of curiosity, of human restlessness, of the quiet need to see what lies beyond the horizon. To hear them is to understand why, when a map appeared centuries later showing a place called Vinland, it struck such a deep chord. It was not just about geography or discovery, it was about validation, about dreams given form. The legends of Vinland do not shout, they hum softly like wind through pine and ocean spray against rock. They belong to that timeless space between truth and imagination, where human wonder lives. Perhaps that is why they endured. Even if the Norse had built only one hut and left only one rusted nail behind, the idea of their voyage changed how we see the world. It suggested that history, like the sea, is wider than we think, and that sometimes what we call myth is simply memory wearing the mask of a story. To understand how a handful of Norse sailors might have reached the distant shores of America, one must first step back into their world, a world of cold winds, iron wills, and horizons that always promised something just out of reach. Around the year 1000, the Viking Age was at its height. From their scattered homesteads across Scandinavia, the Norse had already carved their names into the coastlines of Europe. They had raided monasteries in Britain, traded silver in Byzantium, and built colonies on the fringes of the known world. Yet even among them, there burned a hunger that could not be satisfied by plunder or settlement alone, a quiet, persistent urge to see what lay beyond the edge of the map. They were seafarers in the truest sense. Their longships were miracles of design, sleek, symmetrical, and light enough to be carried over land when rivers ran shallow. Each plank was carved from living wood, curved to flex with the sea. The oars moved in rhythm, the sails caught the wind like a living thing, and the hulls rode the waves with the grace of seabirds. These ships were not just vessels, they were extensions of the Norse spirit, bold, resilient, and endlessly curious. The North Atlantic was not a barrier to them but a pathway. To a Viking, the unknown was not to be feared. It was an invitation. The Norse expansion westward happened almost like a heartbeat, one pulse after another. First came the settlement of the Faroe Islands, then Iceland, then Greenland, each leap a little further into the fog. Life in these places was harsh and unforgiving, yet the Norse adapted with characteristic endurance. They learned to farm thin soil, to build turf houses against the wind, to fish the deep waters that surrounded them. But even as they made new homes, they never lost sight of the horizon. To live on the edge of the world was to feel, always, that something else lay just beyond. In Greenland, stories began to spread of lands glimpsed to the west, dark shapes on the horizon seen by sailors blown off course. Some spoke of forested coasts and strange birds, of beaches untouched by frost. To the Norse, who lived surrounded by ice and stone, such tales were irresistible. If there was wood to build with, soil to till, and waters rich with fish, then perhaps another settlement could thrive there. These rumors, half myth and half memory, laid the foundation for what would one day become the voyages to Vinland. But the Norse were more than wanderers. They were keepers of memory. In their society, knowledge was not written on parchment but sung, recited, remembered. Skalds, the poets of the North, preserved their history through verses that carried across generations. A saga was not simply a story, it was a vessel, holding both truth and imagination. When they told of Leif Erikson's sailing west, they were not just describing a journey. They were preserving the echo of countless voyages before and after, the collective memory of a people who refused to believe that any ocean could end their world. Imagine the Greenlandic settlements around that time, small clusters of turf houses huddled against the elements, smoke rising through holes in the roofs, the smell of seal fat and salt air mixing in the wind. In those dim halls, by flickering firelight, someone would begin to speak, of distant coasts, of soft air and trees that whispered in languages unknown. The children would listen wide-eyed, their fathers silent but thoughtful. The sea was calling again. It always did. By the turn of the millennium, the Norse world was changing. Christianity had begun to seep into their old pagan lands, bringing new symbols and new doubts. The age of gods and giants was fading, replaced by the quieter faith of the cross. Yet even as the old beliefs waned, the old hunger remained, the need to explore, to prove, to find meaning beyond familiar shores. The Western Sea, with all its promise and danger, became both a literal and spiritual frontier. Sailing in those days was no small act of courage. The North Atlantic was a living force, unpredictable, violent, and vast. Storms rose from nothing, fog could blind a ship within minutes, and icebergs lurked like silent mountains in the mist. The Norse navigated by stars, by the flight of birds, by the color of the water. They knew how to read the sea the way others read scripture. And when they set out westward, they did so not with certainty, but with faith, faith in their craft, their skill, and the strange, magnetic pull of the horizon. In that faith lies the soul of their legend. Whether or not every detail of the sagas is true, the essence of their spirit cannot be doubted. The Norse reached further than anyone thought possible because they believed the world was larger than they had been told. They believed that knowledge was not confined to maps or scrolls but earned through salt and wind and risk. And that belief, that stubborn refusal to let the horizon be the end, became their greatest legacy. Centuries later, when scholars rediscovered the old Icelandic texts, they found more than adventure tales. They found coded memories, descriptions that matched real geography, distances that made sense only to sailors who had been there. The sagas spoke of sailing past Helgeland and Markland before reaching Vinland, places that align eerily with modern Baffin Island, Labrador, and Newfoundland. It was as though the Norse, through oral tradition alone, had left behind a map of memory, guiding future generations toward the truth of what they had achieved. The echoes of those voyages still live in the landscape. The remains of Norse settlements, the tools buried in cold soil, the fragments of iron and timber, they are silent witnesses to a time when men dared to cross the edge of their world. They remind us that history is not only what survives on paper, but what lingers in the bones of the earth and the dreams of humanity. So when one looks at the Vinland map, that fragile piece of parchment showing a land that shouldn't exist, one is really looking at the final chapter of a much older story. A story written not in ink, but in courage. The sagas were the first maps. The longships were the pens. And the ocean, vast and unending, was their canvas. In the summer of 1960, the northern winds carried two travelers to a lonely tip of Newfoundland, a rugged land of bogs, stunted trees, and endless gray sea. Helge Ingstad, a Norwegian explorer, and his wife, Anne Stein, an archaeologist, had come in search of something that most scholars believed did not exist. They were following whispers, faint, improbable rumors that somewhere on this barren coast, the Norse had once landed 1,000 years ago. Their boat cut through still waters, the air sharp with salt and the faint cry of seabirds. Ahead lay a small village called Lance Eaux Meadows, nothing more than a scattering of fishing huts, a place that seemed forgotten by time. The locals were polite but skeptical when Helge began asking questions. He carried with him maps and notes, references to the Vinland sagas that spoke of a promontory with meadows, and the farthest land reached by Leif Erikson. He asked the villagers if they knew of any old ruins or strange mounds in the earth. One old fisherman nodded toward a patch of uneven ground above the bay. "There are bumps up there," he said, "like old houses that sank." It was nothing, perhaps, just the marks of ancient turf houses long eroded by wind and rain. But to Helge and Anne it was enough. They set out on foot, pushing through the wet grass, hearts steady and hopeful. What they found did not look like much at first: gentle rises in the soil, stones half buried in moss, bits of old timber jutting from the ground. Yet the shapes were unmistakable. The foundations formed neat rectangles, the pattern familiar to anyone who knew Norse building traditions. and knelt beside one of the mounds, her gloved hand brushing away the moss. "This looks like a longhouse," she whispered. The Atlantic wind howled around them as though in answer. It was a moment that seemed to stretch across centuries, the touch of a hand connecting two worlds that had once known each other. Excavation began carefully. The work was slow, meticulous, and uncertain. Each layer of soil they removed revealed something older, something stranger. Beneath the turf, they uncovered the outlines of 8 buildings, dwellings, workshops, and storage huts. The walls were made of peat and timber, the construction identical to that found in Greenland and Iceland. The layout of the site spoke of an organized settlement, a place built with purpose and knowledge of the land. The deeper they dug, the more the past began to breathe again. Then came the artifacts, a rusty iron nail, a fragment of a bronze pin, the remains of a small forge. Ironworking was unknown among the indigenous peoples of Newfoundland at that time, but it was a cornerstone of Norse life. The Ingstads knew instantly what they had found. "This," Anne said, holding up a piece of slagged metal between her fingers, "is Norse." There was no mistaking it. The sagas had spoken true. The Vikings had been here. News spread slowly, then like wildfire. Scholars, historians, and skeptics alike came to the remote northern site to see for themselves. Some arrived expecting disappointment, another romantic myth debunked by hard science. But as they walked among the unearthed walls and handled the relics of a forgotten time, their doubts softened. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the age, around the year 1000. The structures, tools, and even the style of the iron nails matched those used by Norse settlers in Greenland. For the first time in modern history, physical evidence had emerged that the Vikings had crossed the Atlantic and set foot in North America. The excavation took on a near-spiritual tone. Each artifact seemed to hum with memory. A spindle whorl hinted at women among the settlers. A small, sharpened bone needle spoke of daily life, mending clothes against the cold. The remains of a smithy revealed how the Norse had brought their craft with them, forging tools from bog iron dug out of the marshes nearby. This was no accidental landing. It was a settlement, built to last, even if only for a brief time. The sound of hammer on anvil had once echoed across this bay, the same rhythm that had filled Viking halls halfway across the world. For Anne, the discovery was deeply emotional. She often said she could feel the presence of those long-dead settlers in the soil, the hum of their work, the quiet of their nights. She imagined the flicker of firelight spilling from their turf houses, the smell of smoke and seaweed mingling in the air. She could almost hear the creak of wooden doors, the low murmur of voices speaking Old Norse beneath the northern stars. The site at Lance Eux Meadows was more than archaeology, it was a conversation across 1,000 years. Still, not everyone accepted it easily. Some historians resisted the implications, clinging to the belief that Columbus had been the first European to reach the New World. Others feared that acknowledging Viking presence in America might muddy the clean lines of the narrative they had taught for generations. But the evidence was undeniable. The Norse had come, settled briefly, and left again, long before the Renaissance ever began. Their journey had been forgotten, but not erased. As excavation continued, the shape of the Norse story in America began to emerge. The settlement appeared to have been temporary, a base for exploration rather than a permanent colony. From here, the Norse likely journeyed further south, perhaps reaching the wooded lands they called Markland and Vinland. The sagas told of grapes and mild weather, details that now seemed less like fantasy and more like distant memories of the coastal regions of New Brunswick or Nova Scotia. When the Ingstads finally stepped back from the dig, their work complete, they gazed across the windswept bay. The waves broke softly against the shore, as they must have done when Leif Erikson's ship first landed here a millennium before. Nothing about the scene had changed. The same wind, the same gray sea, the same enduring solitude. And in that sameness, there was something beautiful, the quiet proof that history does not vanish, it only waits to be found. Lance Eux Meadows became a monument not just to discovery, but to patience, to the idea that truth, like buried iron, endures beneath the soil until someone dares to look for it. The Norse presence in North America was no longer legend whispered around firelight. It was carved into the earth itself. The world would have to remember that the first footsteps from Europe to the Americas were not left by conquistadors, but by explorers guided by starlight, courage, and an unyielding need to see what lay beyond the horizon. The map that came to be known as the Vinland map was unlike anything scholars had ever encountered. Its lines were delicate, almost hesitant, yet their meaning was audacious. Across the parchment stretched the known world of the Middle Ages, Europe, Africa, and Asia, drawn in the uneven geometry typical of the 15th century. But beyond Greenland, where medieval maps usually ended in a blur of imagination and monsters, this one continued. There, in unmistakable shape, lay another landmass, large, defined, and labeled in faded Latin letters as Vinlanda Insula. The island of Vinland. A place that, according to accepted history, should not have appeared on any European map made before Columbus. When the map surfaced in 1957, it arrived quietly, shrouded in mystery. No one knew its true origin. It was said to have been found bound within an old volume of medieval texts, one describing the world according to ancient scholars, another recounting the travels of the Norse. The parchment itself was fragile, the color of old bone, with faint creases that spoke of centuries in darkness. Yale University acquired it for study, and soon, a quiet storm began to brew in the world of history and cartography. Those who first saw it were torn between awe and disbelief. The coastline of Vinland, as depicted, seemed strikingly accurate when compared to the actual shape of northeastern North America. It was not a vague scribble, not a rumor drawn by imagination. It had the weight of precision. The mapmaker, whoever he was, had known something he should not have known. And if the map were genuine, then someone in medieval Europe had evidence of the Americas nearly 500 years before Columbus's voyage. The implications were staggering. In that realization lay both beauty and danger. For centuries, the story of discovery had followed a clean, simple line, from the Old World to the New, led by Columbus under the Spanish crown. But the Vinland map threatened to disrupt that symmetry. It whispered of a different history, one where a handful of Norse sailors, guided by wind and instinct, had reached America long before empires and conquest. It was a story of quiet courage, of discovery without domination. And in the academic world, that was almost heresy. The map's lines were drawn in a fine, dark brown ink that had faded unevenly. The handwriting was unmistakably medieval, the Latin full of abbreviations typical of the 15th century. Along the margins were notes referencing Greenland and Iceland, and the enigmatic Vinland. To some experts, it appeared authentic beyond question. It even seemed to reflect the worldview of a time when the Church still dictated the shape of the cosmos. And yet, the inclusion of a Western landmass shattered that worldview entirely. It did not fit with anything known from the cartography of the Middle Ages. As Yale prepared to unveil the map, word spread through scholarly circles like wildfire. Newspapers caught wind of it, headlines proclaiming that history itself might need rewriting. Did the Vikings discover America? Ancient map challenges Columbus. The public was enthralled, but academia bristled. Some scholars accused Yale of sensationalism, others demanded caution. The map, they argued, was too perfect, too convenient, appearing precisely when the world was ready to romanticize Viking exploration. Still, for a time, hope outweighed doubt. Experts compared the handwriting to known medieval texts, analyzed the parchment, and traced the style of Latin to the mid-15th century. Everything seemed to fit. The Vinland map appeared to predate Columbus by decades, perhaps even a century. Its existence suggested that the Norse voyages had not only occurred, but that their memory had survived in Europe, passed down quietly through manuscripts that never reached the eyes of kings or cartographers. And so, for a brief, shining moment, the world stood on the edge of revelation. Imagine the scene, museum curators in crisp gloves leaning over glass cases, tracing the coastline of Vinland with their eyes, journalists whispering about a secret history finally brought to light, historians pacing their offices, caught between excitement and dread. If this map were real, then everything they had taught, every textbook, every timeline, would need to be rewritten. Yet, in the soft light of Yale's display hall, there was something haunting about the map. Its parchment shimmered faintly, almost alive under the glass. It seemed to hold a secret that refused to rest easily in the modern world. Some said they felt a strange pull when they looked at it, as though the lines themselves were whispering, reminding them of voyages forgotten by time. Others dismissed such feelings as nonsense, the romantic imagination of those who wanted to believe too much. Behind the scenes, debates grew fierce. Could medieval monks truly have known of Vinland? If so, how had they learned of it? Had Norse explorers brought back detailed descriptions of their journeys, preserved in obscure Icelandic manuscripts? Or had the map been altered later, perhaps by a hand eager to insert legend into history? Each theory opened new questions, none with certain answers. As months turned into years, the Vinland map became more than a document. It became a mirror for human belief. To some, it represented proof that history was far richer, more connected, than we had dared to imagine. To others, it was a dangerous illusion, tempting scholars to trade evidence for wonder. Its power lay not only in what it showed, but in what it implied, that knowledge can survive in silence, hidden between centuries, waiting to be found again. When visitors stood before it at Yale, they saw not just ink and parchment, but the possibility of rediscovering something sacred, a forgotten chapter of humanity's restless search for the unknown. It stirred the imagination in ways few artifacts ever could. The world wanted to believe in it. The map seemed to offer more than history. It offered myth made tangible, a bridge between legend and fact. And yet, in the quiet corners of the academic world, some eyes had already begun to narrow. The ink looked strange under certain lights, too dark in some places, too pale in others. The handwriting, though medieval in style, bore quirks no one could quite explain. The story behind the map's discovery was vague, its provenance incomplete. A few voices warned that mystery can be both beautiful and dangerous, that sometimes what seems too perfect is not truth, but imitation. Still, the allure of the Vinland map refused to fade. It defied skepticism, it provoked obsession, and it awakened a forgotten wonder in those who studied it. Whether a relic of truth or a deception born of ambition, it had already changed history in one undeniable way. It had reminded humanity that our past is not fixed, that the boundaries of what we know can always be redrawn. The map was more than parchment and ink. It was a question, one that refused to be silenced. The first serious doubts about the Vinland map did not arise from emotion or ideology, but from science. In the early 1960s, Yale had proudly unveiled the artifact to the world, and for a time the map's fame seemed unshakable. It appeared in museums, in textbooks, in glossy magazine spreads beside headlines about the Vikings who had discovered America. But then, quietly, a few scientists began to look closer. Under the microscope, the ink told a story that the parchment could not hide. What they saw was not ancient dust, but something strange, something modern. The ink, at first glance, looked like typical medieval iron gall, a brownish pigment made from oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic. But when chemists examined it using ultraviolet light and spectrographic analysis, an unsettling truth emerged. The ink contained traces of a compound known as anatase, a form of titanium dioxide. That, in itself, was not shocking. What was shocking was how it appeared. The microscopic crystals of anatase found in the Vinland map's ink matched those used in modern industrial pigments, a form that had only been manufactured since the 1920s. This single discovery cracked the foundation of belief that scholars had built around the map. If the ink were modern, the map could not be medieval. Some experts argued that contamination was possible, that the map might have been touched, retouched, or restored in modern times. But the pattern of anatase was consistent throughout the entire drawing, embedded in every line and curve, from the coast of Europe to the mysterious outline of Vinland itself. That meant it had been there from the beginning. Yale's curators, caught between pride and responsibility, invited more experts to test the artifact. They hoped, perhaps, that some new evidence would overturn the troubling results. Teams from the British Museum and other institutions repeated the analysis, and reached the same conclusion. The ink was modern. The map, at least as drawn, could not predate the 20th century. Yet even as the scientific verdict hardened, Others refused to accept it. They insisted that history was full of anomalies, that sometimes materials behave in unpredictable ways, that perhaps the Anates had formed naturally over centuries of decay. The debate grew fierce and personal. Careers were built and broken on the question of whether the Vinland map was real. Those who had defended it for years felt betrayed by the data, as though truth itself had played a cruel trick. Others, who had long suspected forgery, felt vindicated but uneasy, for a forgery so masterful, so convincing, seemed to mock their discipline. How could so many experts have been fooled for so long? How could a hoax, if that's what it was, have slipped so perfectly into the texture of accepted history? Meanwhile, the public followed every twist with fascination. Newspapers turned the scientific debate into a spectacle. Fake or fortune? One headline asked. The map that fooled the world, said another. To most readers, the truth mattered less than the story itself, the romance of mystery, the thrill of discovery, the shadow of deceit. The Vinland map had transcended scholarship. It had become a cultural legend, part of the eternal human dance between belief and doubt. Inside Yale's archives, however, the mood was somber. The parchment was ancient, that much was certain, dated by radiocarbon analysis to around the mid-15th century. But parchment can be reused, old materials can serve new lies. The ink, the crucial element, was younger, too young. The discovery left the map stranded between two worlds, the medieval and the modern. It was neither wholly ancient nor comfortably contemporary. It was something in between, a ghost stitched together from mismatched centuries. And then came the question that no one wanted to ask aloud. Who would have done it? Forgery, after all, is rarely an act of greed alone. The Vinland map's creator, if it was indeed a forgery, had shown immense knowledge of medieval cartography, the style of script, the Latin phrasing, even the way coastlines were drawn. This was no amateur's work. It was a scholar's deception, crafted to survive scrutiny. Some whispered that it might have been made in the early 20th century, when fascination with Viking exploration was surging. Others speculated it was a Cold War hoax, an attempt to rewrite history in favor of Northern Europe, to challenge the Mediterranean's dominance in the story of discovery. There were even darker theories, that the map had been created not for fame, but for influence, to subtly shift academic focus, to sell manuscripts, to lure wealthy collectors. The original volume in which the map had supposedly been found had passed through the hands of several dealers, each with a vague story and missing documentation. The trail was muddy, full of contradictions. It was as if the map had simply appeared, stepping out of the shadows of history with perfect timing, just when the world was most eager to believe that Columbus was not the first. Yet even as the evidence piled up, some continued to argue that authenticity could not be disproven so easily. They pointed out inconsistencies in the testing methods, questioned the provenance of the samples, and highlighted the lack of consensus on how Anates forms. A few scholars clung to the possibility that the map might be partly genuine, an old base drawing later retraced with modern ink. It was a comforting thought, allowing both history and science to share the same fragile space. But deep down, the world knew. The magic had begun to fade. The Vinland map's glow, that sense of wonder it once evoked, now carried a different kind of fascination, tinged with melancholy. It had become a symbol of how much we want to believe, how easily the desire for discovery can cloud judgment. And yet, there was beauty even in that realization. Because in the end, the map had achieved something few objects ever do. It had forced humanity to question the limits of its own knowledge. The scientists who exposed the fraud did not set out to destroy wonder, they sought only truth. But truth, as the map showed, can be as strange and powerful as myth. For whether genuine or forged, the Vinland map had already changed the way we see the past. It had shown that history is not fixed, that every discovery carries with it the potential to deceive as much as to enlighten. And in that sense, even as its authenticity crumbled, its legend endured. In the dim light of the laboratory, the parchment still looked beautiful. Its lines, though false, still whispered of adventure and mystery. And perhaps, some thought, that was enough, not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of the human hunger for meaning. because long after the ink had been condemned, the map continued to haunt the imagination. It asked a question that no scientific test could ever fully answer. What if, in some forgotten time, the Vikings really had stood on those distant shores and someone, somewhere, had drawn their memory into the fragile skin of a map? The controversy surrounding the Vinland map had reached a fever pitch by the late 1970s, yet something remarkable happened. Rather than fade into obscurity as a confirmed forgery, the map refused to die. It lingered, defiant, in both scholarly journals and the public imagination, like an echo of an unresolved dream. People simply didn't want to let go. The idea that the Vikings might have reached America long before Columbus had taken root so deeply that no laboratory test could uproot it. To many, the truth of the map was less important than what it represented, a challenge to convention, a whisper that the history they'd been taught was incomplete. Across museums and lecture halls, debates raged not only about the ink and parchment, but about what the map meant for the human story itself. Historians began revisiting the old Norse sagas, the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, searching for traces of voyages to a distant western land. In those ancient Icelandic texts, written centuries before the Vinland map ever appeared, were tales of rugged ships, cold seas, and a place beyond the horizon where wild grapes grew and the air was gentle. The name they gave it was Vinland. And while many had dismissed those stories as myth, the map had resurrected them, given them a shape, and made them impossible to ignore. Scholars pored over the sagas with renewed intensity. They noted how detailed the descriptions were, how they spoke of sailing west from Greenland, how they described coastlines that seemed eerily familiar to modern readers. One passage mentioned a region where the days were long. Another spoke of forests vast enough to build entire fleets of ships. It was hard not to draw comparisons with Newfoundland or the shores of Labrador. The sagas, once dismissed as poetic fiction, began to look suspiciously like history disguised as legend. And then came a new wave of evidence, not from parchment, but from the earth itself. In 1960, at LanceEux Meadows in Newfoundland, two Norwegian archaeologists, Helga and Stein Ingstad, had uncovered the remains of what appeared to be a Viking settlement. There were the unmistakable outlines of sod-built houses, iron nails forged in the Norse style, and even remnants of a spindle used for weaving. The site dated to around the year 1000, centuries before Columbus. It was undeniable proof that the Norse had crossed the Atlantic. The discovery didn't authenticate the Vinland map, but it gave its story a strange, haunting legitimacy. Suddenly, the question wasn't whether the Vikings had reached America. They clearly had. The question became, how far did they go? How much did they know? And did anyone in Europe remember? The Vinland map, even as a possible forgery, seemed to echo a truth the world had only just begun to accept. It had, in its own way, predicted what archaeology would later prove. That coincidence alone was enough to keep the flame of mystery alive. The map's defenders seized on this connection. They argued that perhaps, even if the physical map was forged, it might have been based on an older, genuine source, a lost document, now vanished, that had once recorded Norse knowledge of the Western lands. After all, they reasoned, how could a modern forger in the early 20th century have known to include Vinland decades before solid archaeological evidence of Viking presence in North America was found? The timing seemed too perfect, too prophetic. It gave the mystery an almost spiritual weight, as if the truth had insisted on revealing itself, even through deceit. Meanwhile, those who had once mocked the idea of Norse discovery found themselves revising their tone. Textbooks changed. Schoolchildren learned that long before Columbus sailed under the Spanish flag, Viking longships had cut across the Atlantic, their sails taut with northern wind. The narrative of discovery began to shift, subtly but profoundly. Europe's encounter with the New World was no longer the story of one man's triumph, but of a series of forgotten crossings, of risk, loss, and quiet endurance. In this evolving landscape of history, the Vinland map became less an artifact and more a symbol, a ghost of a truth too persistent to die. Scholars began to speak of it as a mythic document, not because it was real, but because it served a mythic purpose, to remind us that the boundaries of the known world are always temporary. It had inspired curiosity, debate, and even humility, qualities often absent from historical study. In classrooms and documentaries, the map story was told not as fact, but as parable, a cautionary tale about both the seduction of discovery and the fragility of truth. But the most haunting legacy of the map lay not in libraries or museums. It lived in the imagination of ordinary people. There was something deeply human about its endurance, something poetic in the way it refused to fade. For those who stared at its faded lines, the question of authenticity began to matter less. What mattered was the image itself, the faint outline of an unknown coast, drawn centuries before its time. It represented the yearning to know, to reach, to map the unmapped, an urge that has driven every era of exploration. Late at night, in quiet study rooms and dim museum halls, visitors still found themselves drawn to the story. Some saw the Vinland map as a beautiful deception, a symbol of human gullibility. Others saw it as an act of faith, proof that our desire to believe in lost knowledge is part of what makes us who we are. The map, like all great mysteries, reflected not the past but the present, our own need to fill silence with meaning. Even now, decades after its debunking, the Vinland map continues to appear in documentaries, in articles, in the minds of those fascinated by forgotten journeys. It is discussed alongside other historical enigmas, the Voynich manuscript, the Shroud of Turin, the Pyrie Reis map, each one a thread in the tapestry of human longing for the extraordinary. Whether forged by cunning hands or born of forgotten truth, the Vinland map's story endures because it touches something primal, the belief that there are still secrets hidden in plain sight, waiting to be rediscovered. And so the map survives, not as a relic of ink and parchment, but as a symbol of something far larger. It is a mirror held up to the human spirit, showing both our brilliance and our blindness. In its delicate lines lies the tension between faith and evidence, myth and fact, hope and disillusionment. It reminds us that even in an age of satellites and data, mystery still has power. And perhaps, in that mystery, the Vikings themselves are smiling, their true journeys long past, yet their legends forever expanding, carried not by wind and sail, but by the imagination of those who refuse to stop wondering what might still lie beyond the edge of the map. The Norse voyages to Vinland were not simple adventures. They were fraught with challenges that tested every ounce of courage, endurance, and skill a sailor could muster. Imagine standing on the deck of a longship as the North Atlantic stretches endlessly before you, a wall of gray waves rising and falling like living mountains. The wind bites your skin, salt water lashes your face, and the cold penetrates even the thickest woolen garments. Above, the sky is a shifting canvas of pale light and dark clouds, sometimes revealing the faint shimmer of distant stars, sometimes hiding all navigation in an impenetrable fog. These were the conditions under which men like Leif Erikson ventured, guided by instinct, memory, and the ancient knowledge of their ancestors. The voyages themselves were feats of precise calculation and bold improvisation. Vikings did not have the luxury of modern instruments. They relied on the sun, the stars, and the flight of birds to find direction. They noted the color of the ocean, the shape of the clouds, and the movement of icebergs. Every observation mattered, every instinct counted. One miscalculation could send a longship hundreds of miles off course, into ice-choked waters from which few returned. Yet these sailors pressed on, driven by curiosity, by necessity, and by the unspoken promise of the unknown lands whispered about in Greenlandic halls and Icelandic sagas. Beyond the physical hazards of the sea lay the trials of provisioning and survival. Ships could carry only so much food, and much of it was preserved and salted, lacking in freshness and nutrition. Water was stored in barrels that could spoil or leak, leaving the crew at the mercy of rainfall or bitter, brackish alternatives. Storms often destroyed supplies, leaving men to ration what little they had while navigating towering waves and winds that could snap timber and sail alike. Yet the Norse were resourceful. They fished, hunted, and foraged whenever possible, making use of every advantage the sea and land offered. When land finally appeared, it was both a blessing and a challenge. The shorelines described in the sagas, long beaches, rocky cliffs, and dense forests, had to be navigated with care. Vikings would anchor their ships in hidden coves, often scouting inland before fully committing to settlement. In Vinland, they encountered fertile soil and abundant game, yet even paradise came with threats. The indigenous peoples, whom they called Skrælings, were cautious and sometimes hostile. Interactions ranged from trade to confrontation, requiring diplomacy and caution. The Norse had to balance curiosity with self-preservation, learning quickly that survival depended on respect, observation, and careful planning. Life in the Vinland settlements demanded constant labor. Longhouses had to be constructed from local timber and sod, often under harsh weather conditions. Firewood had to be gathered, food hunted or gathered, and tools repaired or forged anew. Every day was a negotiation with the elements, a fight to turn raw land into a livable space. Even small comforts, a warm bed, a cooked meal, a roof over one's head, were victories. The sagas speak of these tasks in passing, but imagining them in detail reveals the relentless rhythm of survival that underpinned the extraordinary achievement of reaching and settling such distant shores. Yet amid these challenges, there were moments of awe and wonder that defined the voyages as more than mere survival. The beauty of the northern lights reflected on icy waters, the scent of forests untouched by human hands, the sound of waves breaking against a quiet shore, these were experiences that inspired poetry, memory, and a deep sense of connection to the world. The Norse were explorers not only of geography but of sensation and perception, mapping the emotional as well as the physical landscape of Vinland. Communication and navigation remained constant challenges. Without written maps or compasses, knowledge had to be memorized and shared orally. Leaders like Leif Erikson relied on a combination of memory, observation, and trust in their crews. Mistakes could be fatal, yet trust in skill and experience allowed them to press on. Oral knowledge passed from sailor to sailor, from generation to generation, became the foundation for the sagas, the very texts that centuries later inspired searches and discoveries. In that sense, the journey itself was a living, breathing archive of human ingenuity and resilience. The psychological toll of these expeditions cannot be overstated. Isolation, fear, and uncertainty weighed heavily on the crews. Nights in the North Atlantic could be terrifying, with howling winds and black waves that seemed to rise endlessly. Sailors had to contend with sickness, injury, and the constant threat of starvation. Yet they also experienced camaraderie, shared purpose, and the exhilaration of witnessing lands no other European had seen. The sagas capture this delicate balance between fear and fascination, showing us that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it in pursuit of something greater. Finally, the Norse voyages to Vinland stand as a testament to human curiosity. The sailors did not seek fame, nor did they anticipate recognition. Their motivation was the same that drives explorers in every era: the need to understand, to see, and to touch a world beyond their own. The land they found was fleeting in their experience, sometimes hostile, sometimes generous. Their settlements were temporary, their impact minimal in historical terms. Yet the very act of reaching Vinland, of standing on its shores, mapping its forests and rivers, and recording its existence in memory and saga, represents a profound human achievement. In reflecting on these journeys, we can see why the Norse were among history's greatest explorers. They combined courage, knowledge, and adaptability in a world that offered no guarantees. They crossed oceans that seemed infinite, faced unknown peoples and environments, and left traces of their presence for future generations to find. Their voyages remind us that discovery is not measured solely by permanence, but by the act of daring to see beyond what is known, and by the stories that endure long after the travelers themselves have vanished. The saga of Vinland, when viewed through this lens, becomes more than a historical footnote. It is an epic of endurance, intellect, and imagination. The challenges of the journey, the storms, the cold, the scarcity, and the uncertainty only heighten the achievement. And while the Vinland map may be a forgery, and while some physical traces may be sparse, the essence of these voyages is undeniable. The Norse reached further than their contemporaries dared to imagine, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire wonder, curiosity, and the quiet thrill of human exploration. The notion of Vikings in America long before Columbus transforms our understanding of history into something richer, more layered, and infinitely more human. When we examine the sagas and archaeological evidence together, a vivid picture begins to emerge, one of daring individuals braving the unknown, of societies capable of crossing oceans with nothing but wind, sail, and memory. It forces us to reconsider what we often take for granted: the linear progression of discovery, the comfortable narratives taught in classrooms, the tidy stories of empires and conquest. The reality, as the evidence suggests, is far more complex, messy, and captivating. At LanceEux Meadows, the settlement reveals the ingenuity and adaptability of the Norse. 8 longhouses, arranged in neat rows, provide more than shelter. They represent planning, foresight, and knowledge of local resources. Foundations dug into the earth, walls constructed from sod and timber, and hearths carefully placed to conserve warmth all speak to a society capable of surviving in a harsh and unfamiliar environment. The settlers were not explorers in passing. They were colonists, even if only temporarily, bringing with them knowledge, tools, and a way of life adapted from the icy reaches of Greenland and Iceland to the forests and shores of Newfoundland. The artifacts unearthed at the site provide subtle yet profound glimpses into daily life. Iron nails, forged locally from bog iron, reveal not only technological skill but also the Norse understanding of resource utilization. A spindle whorl hints at the presence of women, weaving thread for clothing and sails. Bones of domesticated animals indicate careful planning and adaptation, while remnants of a small forge suggest the settlers were capable of repairing tools and creating implements essential for survival. Each artifact is a whisper from the past, carrying with it the labor, thought, and care of people navigating an alien land. The interactions with the indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skraelings, add another layer of complexity. These encounters were not uniform. Some were peaceful, involving trade and cautious curiosity. Others were hostile, resulting in skirmishes and retreat. The sagas record these episodes in fragmented, almost poetic ways, emphasizing both the danger and the intrigue of cultural contact. The Norse were far from invincible. They were small groups in a vast wilderness, reliant on observation, diplomacy, and occasional force to negotiate survival. Yet these encounters also demonstrate the broader interconnectedness of human societies, even in the early second millennium, across oceans and continents. The evidence also suggests that the Norse in Vinland were mindful of sustainability and temporality. Unlike later European colonists, who often sought to dominate and extract, the Norse settlements appear to have been ephemeral, designed to last for a season or a few years, not permanently. Crops may have been planted, animals tended, and shelters constructed with care, yet there is little indication of long-term occupation. Perhaps the harsh winters, distance from supply lines, or encounters with indigenous peoples made permanence impractical. Regardless, this transient approach demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of environmental limits and the risks inherent in transatlantic exploration. Historians and archaeologists alike have debated why the Norse did not establish permanent colonies in North America. Some argue that the lure of Greenland and Iceland, lands closer to home, with more familiar climates and communities, outweighed the potential of Vinland. Others point to conflicts with indigenous groups or logistical challenges as decisive factors. What is clear, however, is that the Norse were not ignorant of the land's potential. The sagas describe fertile meadows, abundant forests, and resources that could sustain life. Their decision to leave may have been strategic rather than accidental, reflecting the pragmatic and cautious nature of exploration in an unforgiving environment. The notion of a temporary settlement also reshapes how we think about early exploration itself. Discovery, in the Norse context, was not about conquest or permanent possession. It was about knowledge, observation, and adaptation. The stories preserved in the sagas, the evidence unearthed in Newfoundland, and even the disputed Vinland map together suggest that human curiosity often precedes empire. Before Columbus's voyages brought lasting European presence to the Americas, the Vikings were already sketching coastlines, planting crops, and learning the rhythms of a distant land. Their experience reframes discovery not as a triumph of dominance but as a layered, human process involving risk, failure, and resilience. Furthermore, the Norse presence in North America has a poetic dimension. Standing on the same shores as these early explorers, one can almost feel the faint echo of longships cutting through cold waters, the creak of timber, the low murmur of voices in Old Norse. The landscape itself, rugged, windswept, and uncannily beautiful, preserves the memory of human ambition, endurance, and adaptation. It becomes more than a historical site. It is a bridge across centuries, connecting modern observers with those who dared to venture where no others had yet stood. This reframing also challenges the conventional narrative of European exceptionalism in the story of the Americas. It reminds us that exploration and discovery are not solely the province of one culture, one nation, or one heroic figure. The Norse voyages reveal a different kind of history, one in which small groups, guided by courage and knowledge, can leave marks that endure for centuries. It underscores that the act of exploration itself is an inherently human endeavor, not the privilege of empires or the result of conquest alone. Finally, the enduring fascination with Vinland, the Ingstad's discovery, and the Vinland map, authentic or not, reflects a deep psychological truth. Humans are compelled by the unknown. The desire to imagine what lies beyond the horizon, to map unseen lands, to leave a trace in history, is universal. The Norse voyages and the evidence that survives from them speak not only to the audacity of those individuals but also to the timeless human need to seek, to learn, and to connect across space and time. In the end, Vinland is more than a historical curiosity, it is a testament to exploration itself. The Norse were trailblazers navigating uncharted waters, negotiating unfamiliar landscapes, and interacting with peoples entirely unknown to them. They remind us that history is not simply a record of dates and events, but a living narrative of human ingenuity, courage, and imagination. And while the Vinland map remains controversial and the physical traces of Norse life are limited, the story endures, as rich, compelling, and human as the people who first set foot on those distant shores. The fascination with the Vinland map extends beyond the boundaries of academia into a broader contemplation of history, imagination, and human perception. Even as debates raged over its authenticity, the very existence of the map, whether genuine or forged, forced historians and the public alike to reconsider the neat timelines and accepted narratives that have long dominated our understanding of exploration. It challenges the idea that discovery follows a straight path from ignorance to knowledge, revealing instead a world in which information is fragmented, delayed, or even lost entirely. The map's lines, delicate yet deliberate, act as a bridge between centuries, connecting the medieval imagination with modern curiosity, urging us to reconsider what we define as historical truth. The map also prompts reflection on the nature of evidence and belief. In the 15th century, knowledge of distant lands was a blend of observation, hearsay, and imagination. Cartographers often relied on travelers' tales, oral reports, and sometimes the faint whispers of sailors' recollections filtered through decades or centuries. The Vinland map, whether a faithful copy of such knowledge or a modern forgery, embodies this tension between what is known and what is believed. It invites us to question the reliability of our sources, the biases of those who record history, and the extent to which legend and fact are inseparable in shaping our understanding of the past. Moreover, the debate surrounding the map reveals something profoundly human, our desire to find meaning and continuity where there is uncertainty. Scholars, collectors, and enthusiasts were captivated not only by the possibility of rewriting the history of exploration but by the thrill of engaging with a mystery that refuses to yield simple answers. The map became a mirror, reflecting the hopes, doubts, and ambitions of those who studied it. Some saw a lost chapter of human courage, others a cautionary tale about the seduction of certainty, yet all were drawn to its allure. In this way, the map transcends its physical form, becoming a story in itself, alive in the minds of those who engage with it. The Vinland map also occupies a unique space between the tangible and the symbolic. As an artifact, it is a fragile piece of parchment marked by centuries of aging, inked in precise lines that capture the contours of lands both familiar and speculative. Yet as a symbol, it represents the human drive to explore, to imagine, and to connect disparate pieces of knowledge into coherent understanding. Its presence in museums and scholarly collections serves not merely as an object of study but as an invitation to journey through time and thought, to grapple with the tension between what is documented and what is possible. Critically, the story of the Vinland map highlights the interplay between human imagination and the natural world. The Norse, reaching Vinland 1,000 years ago, relied on observation, intuition, and careful study of their environment. Their knowledge of currents, winds, and seasonal changes was practical and empirical, yet it was transmitted orally, embedded in stories that were eventually recorded in sagas and perhaps reflected in maps. The map, whether accurate or invented, encapsulates this merging of observation and imagination. It reminds us that exploration is not solely about measurement and data but also about interpretation, storytelling, and the translation of experience into shared knowledge. This tension between empirical evidence and narrative is what gives the Vinland map its enduring power. It challenges the rigid dichotomy between fact and fiction, revealing history as a living dialogue rather than a fixed record. Each line, each label, each contour prompts questions about human curiosity, the transmission of knowledge, and the ways in which societies remember or forget their encounters with the unknown. In a sense, the map serves as a philosophical artifact as much as a historical one, inviting reflection on how we construct our understanding of the past and how stories, whether true or imagined, shape collective memory. Furthermore, the map's story underscores the fragility and resilience of knowledge. The Norse voyages themselves left only faint traces, ephemeral settlements, fleeting encounters, and oral traditions that survived through centuries. The map, authentic or not, mirrors that fragility. It is a single piece of evidence carrying the weight of an entire narrative, subject to scrutiny, doubt, and reinterpretation. Yet its endurance, even in controversy, demonstrates the resilience of human curiosity. Despite conflicting evidence, debates, and the passage of time, the idea of Vinland persists in the collective imagination, revealing how powerful stories can outlast even the most definitive conclusions. In addition, the map invites us to reconsider the nature of exploration itself. Exploration is often romanticized as conquest, expansion, or the pursuit of glory. The Norse approach, as reflected in the sagas and hinted at in the map, was more nuanced. It was about observation, adaptation, and learning. Vinland was not fully colonized. It was experienced, measured, and understood in the moment. The map, whether real or constructed, captures this spirit, a respect for the unknown, an acknowledgement of risk, and an appreciation for the richness of lands beyond familiar horizons. Finally, the Vinland map exemplifies the interplay between time, memory, and human ambition. Centuries separated the Norse voyages from the map's appearance in the 20th century, yet the ideas, stories, and traces of those journeys survived, influencing imaginations across generations. It is a testament to the enduring power of human curiosity and creativity, demonstrating that even the most ephemeral actions can echo through time. In this light, the map is not just an artifact, it is a narrative vessel, carrying the spirit of exploration, the tension between belief and evidence, and the timeless desire to know what lies beyond the horizon. The Vinland map, authentic or forged, thus continues to shape our understanding of history, imagination, and the human drive to discover. Its lines, faded and fragile, trace more than coastlines. They trace the contours of human curiosity itself. It is a reminder that the story of exploration is never simply about land or empire, but about the enduring quest for knowledge, understanding, and connection across the vast expanses of time and space. In every debate, every study, and every whispered tale, the map lives on, a testament to the power of imagination, the persistence of wonder, and the unending human journey toward the unknown. The valley had grown into a place of quiet reverence, its life and rhythm intertwined with the memory of the woman who had once faced fire and hatred. Generations had passed, and yet the story of her courage and mercy remained alive, carried in the hearts of the villagers and the whispers of the wind through the trees. The white flowers, now spread across hills and meadows, glimmered softly under the moon, a living testament to endurance and hope. Travelers and pilgrims would often stop to gaze upon them, feeling the inexplicable calm that seemed to permeate the soil, the air, and their own hearts. It was a peace born not of absence of struggle, but of understanding and harmony, a peace that had been forged through fire, fear, and unwavering courage. The guardian of the valley, once a young woman learning from the healer's legacy, had grown older, her hair streaked with silver and her movements deliberate and calm. Yet her presence remained as powerful as ever, not through force or dominance, but through patience, attentiveness, and quiet authority. She moved through the fields of white flowers like a thread through time, each step measured, each touch of the earth meaningful. Crops thrived, rivers flowed gently, and the animals moved freely, guided by an invisible harmony that seemed to follow her wherever she walked. Visitors often remarked on the sense of calm that settled over them in her presence, as if the land itself was aware and approving. The villagers had learned to live in balance with the valley. They no longer acted out of fear or superstition, but with care and respect for the living world around them. Children grew up understanding the lessons woven into the soil, that patience can nurture life, that observation can prevent harm, and that mercy often carries more strength than force. During harvests and festivals, the villagers would leave small offerings among the white flowers: a ribbon, a piece of cloth, a whispered word of thanks. These gestures were not rituals of magic but acknowledgments of a covenant between human and land, between the past and the present. Even the seasons themselves seemed to honor the valley's legacy. Winters were harsh, yet the flowers endured beneath blankets of snow, their roots drawing sustenance from deep within the soil. Springs brought new life with astonishing abundance, summer rain nourished fields beyond expectation, and autumn's harvests were bountiful. The valley thrived not because it was untouched by challenges, but because it had learned to meet them with courage, attentiveness, and understanding. Every living thing, from the smallest insect to the largest tree, seemed to participate in this balance, responding to the guardian's care and the enduring lessons of the healer before her. Visitors continued to arrive, some seeking aid, others drawn by the whispers of the valley's unusual prosperity and serenity. They watched as she tended the flowers, guided the rivers, and offered gentle remedies for illness and injury. Her actions were never hurried or loud, yet they carried authority, efficiency, and a deep understanding of life's subtle rhythms. Travelers left transformed, carrying stories not of fear, but of grace, mercy, and the quiet power of listening. Even the most skeptical were often humbled, recognizing that the valley's enduring harmony could not be explained by chance alone. As she grew older, the guardian spent more time reflecting near the river that wound through the valley. She would close her eyes and listen to the water, the wind through the trees, and the faint murmur of the earth itself. It was in these moments that she felt the presence of her predecessor most strongly, as if the healer herself were there, guiding, comforting, and reminding her of the delicate balance she had been entrusted to maintain. The valley was not just a home, it was a living teacher, offering lessons in patience, courage, and mercy to all who were willing to learn. The white flowers remained central to the valley's identity. Their petals shimmered with a faint luminescence, particularly in moonlight, and their scent carried subtly on the wind, a gentle reminder of the life and memory they represented. Villagers would gather near the fields in quiet contemplation, children learning to move carefully among the blooms, and elders passing down stories of courage, fear, and redemption. The flowers had become a symbol of endurance, a living monument that did not require stone or inscription, existing instead in soil, air, and memory. Through the decades, the valley became a sanctuary for more than its residents. Travelers, scholars, and those seeking wisdom came to witness the harmony and to learn the lessons embedded in every aspect of life there. The guardian taught without words when she could, guiding hands to soil, showing how to tend crops, how to care for animals, how to listen to the subtle messages of nature. Her teachings were as much about presence and attentiveness as they were about practical knowledge. Every act carried intention, every gesture bore awareness, and every moment reinforced the legacy of courage and mercy that had defined the valley for generations. Even those who arrived with skepticism or fear left with transformed understanding. They carried stories of a valley where the land itself seemed alive, where kindness and attention could affect real change, and where courage could endure beyond fire and hatred. The Guardian never claimed credit. She understood that her life was but a continuation of a story far larger than herself. And the valley, through its rivers, flowers, and soil, continued to whisper the same lesson the healer had taught long ago, that fear destroys, that mercy heals, and that courage sustained over time can transform not just individuals, but entire communities. As twilight fell on the valley, the white flowers glowed softly in the moonlight. The river reflected silver across their petals, the wind carried a faint perfume of earth and blossom, and the Guardian sat quietly among them. She closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the valley flow through her, a slow, steady pulse that connected past and present, human and land, life and memory. In that quiet, timeless space, the legacy of the woman called a witch endured, not in fear or legend, but in the enduring, patient, and quiet power of love, courage, and mercy that had saved an entire village and shaped generations to come. The legacy of Vinland reaches far beyond the physical traces left on the North American coastline or the fragile lines of a controversial map. It resides in the imagination, the stories, and the enduring fascination with the unknown that continues to captivate historians, scholars, and dreamers alike. To consider Vinland is to consider the very essence of exploration, the courage to leave the familiar behind, the patience to navigate vast uncertainties, and the curiosity to perceive patterns and possibilities in uncharted territory. For the Norse, these journeys were both practical and profoundly symbolic, reflecting a worldview in which the edge of the known world beckoned with danger, opportunity, and wonder. The Norse approach to Vinland was deeply pragmatic, yet it was infused with a sense of awe and reverence for the lands they encountered. The forests, rivers, and coasts were not merely resources to be exploited, they were terrains to be understood and negotiated. Timber was felled carefully for building longhouses, firewood was gathered to sustain life through harsh winters, and the land itself was observed for signs of game, edible plants, and fertile soil. At the same time, these acts of survival were interwoven with a broader appreciation for beauty and scale, the shimmer of sunlight on distant waves, the scent of pine-laden air, the distant cries of seabirds marking unseen coves. Each element of the environment was part of a living, breathing tableau that demanded both respect and skill. The interactions with the indigenous peoples of Vinland added an additional layer of complexity and insight. The Norse had to navigate social encounters without the benefit of shared language or long-standing alliances. These engagements ranged from cautious trade to occasional conflict, reflecting a nuanced understanding that survival often depended on negotiation and observation rather than brute force. The sagas record these encounters with a mixture of tension, curiosity, and occasional humor, revealing not only the practical realities of cross-cultural interaction but also the Norse capacity for learning and adaptation. They demonstrate that exploration is as much a social as a geographic endeavor, requiring awareness, empathy, and flexibility. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lance Eaux Meadows corroborates the sagas, providing a tangible connection to these stories. The longhouses, iron tools, and domestic artifacts reveal a sophisticated understanding of construction, metallurgy, and daily living in an unfamiliar environment. These findings illuminate the Norse ability to transplant skills learned in one region, the icy reaches of Greenland or Iceland, into a wholly different landscape. The settlements, though temporary, reflect strategic decision-making. They were sited for access to resources, shelter, and defensive advantage, indicating careful planning rather than haphazard exploration. Yet Vinland's significance extends beyond physical evidence. The saga literature, preserved through centuries of oral tradition, captures the psychological and cultural dimensions of exploration. These stories are rich with emotion, describing fear, excitement, triumph, and despair. They convey the weight of uncertainty and the exhilaration of discovery, offering readers not just a record of events, but a sense of what it meant to stand on the edge of the known world. The sagas are a reminder that exploration is experienced through the human mind and spirit as much as through action and observation. The Vinland map, controversial though it remains, continues to amplify this sense of wonder and possibility. Whether authentic or forged, it challenges linear assumptions about history and invites reflection on the ways knowledge is recorded, preserved, and interpreted. Its lines sketch more than coastlines. They trace human curiosity across centuries, linking the medieval imagination with modern scholarship. The map embodies the tension between empirical evidence and creative speculation, demonstrating that even in doubt, the human desire to understand and document the unknown persists. Vinland also serves as a meditation on the impermanence and fragility of human endeavors. The settlements were temporary, the voyages risky, and the documentation imperfect. Yet the story endures, carried forward by artifacts, written records, and imagination. In this endurance lies a profound lesson. Human ambition is not solely measured by permanence or conquest, but by the willingness to venture, observe, and transmit knowledge across generations. Even fleeting actions, when recorded and remembered, can shape understanding for centuries to come. The broader cultural and psychological significance of Vinland is equally compelling. The voyages demonstrate that human beings are capable of remarkable resilience, ingenuity, and adaptability when confronted with uncertainty. The Norse sailors and settlers relied on observation, memory, cooperation, and social intelligence, navigating an environment that was at once beautiful and hostile. Their experiences challenge modern assumptions about the limits of pre-modern exploration and underscore the universality of curiosity and courage. They remind us that the act of discovery is as much about human qualities, perception, judgment, and imagination, as it is about reaching new lands. Finally, the legacy of Vinland invites us to reflect on the enduring power of stories in shaping our understanding of history. The sagas, archaeological findings, and maps together create a narrative that transcends time, blending fact and imagination into a tapestry of human experience. Vinland is not merely a place, it is a concept, a lens through which we can explore the nature of exploration itself. It symbolizes the drive to push beyond the familiar, to embrace risk, to observe, and to narrate. In every artifact, every line on a map, and every saga passed down through generations, the spirit of Vinland lives on. In contemplating Vinland, we confront the essence of what it means to explore. It is not just the act of crossing oceans or charting coastlines, but the courage to imagine, to adapt, and to endure. The Norse voyages, the fleeting settlements, and the enduring stories remind us that discovery is both a physical and a mental endeavor, demanding skill, insight, and resilience. The story of Vinland endures not because of empire or conquest, but because of the human qualities it celebrates: curiosity, perseverance, imagination, and the unending quest to understand what lies beyond the horizon. The valley had settled into a rhythm that seemed eternal, a slow, measured cadence shaped by decades of care, courage, and quiet attentiveness. Life had flourished here in ways both subtle and extraordinary. The white flowers, now covering the hills, meadows, and riverbanks in an endless shimmer of delicate brilliance, had become symbols not merely of survival, but of enduring hope, patience, and the quiet power of mercy. Their soft glow under moonlight and sunlight alike reminded all who walked among them of the woman who had once faced fire, whose courage and compassion had reshaped the fate of an entire village. The valley itself seemed alive, a living witness to the legacy of care and courage passed down through generations, where every gust of wind, ripple of water, and whisper of leaves carried memory and guidance. The guardian, now aged, with hair fully silvered and movements deliberate yet fluid, moved through the valley with a presence that commanded respect not through fear, but through sheer alignment with the rhythms of life itself. She guided the rivers, tending their flow with patient precision, ensuring that water nourished the fields without flooding them. She walked through crops with hands brushing the leaves, sensing the subtle signs of growth or stress, offering care where it was needed. Animals of all kinds, from birds and deer to livestock and insects, moved freely and without fear in her presence, as though recognizing the balance she embodied. Every action she took was purposeful, every movement a lesson in observation, patience, and the quiet courage that comes from deep understanding rather than force. The villagers had long since internalized the lessons of the valley. Fear had been replaced by attentiveness, cruelty by compassion, and impulsive reaction by deliberate care. Children grew up learning to respect the land, to walk carefully among the white flowers, and to listen to the subtle messages of nature, the soft rustle of leaves, the faint hum of insects, the rhythm of rivers and streams. Adults coordinated planting, harvesting, and animal care with mindful attention, following the example of the guardian. Even the smallest tasks, turning soil, pruning crops, tending the flowers, were performed as acts of reverence for the land that had sustained generations. Life in the valley had become a harmonious blend of observation, action, and reflection, with each individual contributing to the ongoing balance of nature and community. The seasons flowed with their usual cycles, yet each one seemed heightened by the valley's attentiveness. Winter brought frost and snow, yet the white flowers endured beneath the icy blanket, drawing nourishment from deep roots and the warmth of the soil. Spring renewed the valley with astonishing abundance, coaxing crops, flowers, and wildlife into a crescendo of life. Summer rains fell evenly, enriching soil and river alike, while autumn's harvests were generous, providing sustenance and security. Even storms, which might have once threatened destruction, were now weathered with preparation, observation, and thoughtful action. Every challenge became a lesson in resilience, every obstacle an opportunity to reinforce the principles of patience, courage, and mercy that had been cultivated for generations. Travelers continued to arrive, drawn by stories of the valley's serenity, abundance, and unusual harmony. Scholars came to study the unique ecosystem, seekers of wisdom arrived hoping to glimpse a life lived in alignment with the rhythms of the land, and curious travelers came simply to witness the glowing white fields. They watched as the guardian moved through the valley, tending rivers, crops, and animals with precision, yet always with gentleness. Her teachings were never spoken in sermons or decrees. They were demonstrated through her actions, lived in every careful step and deliberate touch. Even the most skeptical observers left transformed, carrying the subtle understanding that life flourishes when guided by attentiveness, compassion, and quiet courage rather than fear or domination. The white flowers themselves had become the heart of the valley's identity. Villagers would pause among them to reflect, children learning care and mindfulness, elders passing down the stories of courage and mercy to new generations. Travelers left offerings of ribbons, small carved tokens, or whispered words of gratitude. These gestures, simple yet profound, reinforced the living connection between humans and the land, creating a cycle of respect and attentiveness that persisted across generations. Each petal seemed to carry memory, each stem a reminder that resilience and beauty arise from care, observation, and patient effort. The guardian often spent twilight hours by the river, letting the water flow through her hands, listening to its rhythm and sensing the pulse of the valley beneath her fingertips. In these quiet moments, she felt the presence of the healer who had come before, guiding her still, offering reassurance and counsel through subtle signs in the movement of leaves, the flight of birds, and the flow of water. This presence was neither ghost nor legend, but an enduring connection of memory and purpose, a continuum of courage and mercy that linked generations. The guardian understood that her work was both stewardship and continuation of a story far larger than herself, a story that had preserved life and reshaped the hearts of countless villagers. Every living being in the valley participated in this delicate balance. Birds nested safely, insects thrived among crops, rivers nourished plants and animals alike, and the soil yielded abundance under careful stewardship. Humans, guided by observation and attentive care, reinforced this harmony through their actions, ensuring that life flourished across species and generations. Festivals and harvest celebrations were simple yet profound, honoring the rhythms of the land and the enduring lessons of courage, patience, and mercy. These celebrations were not performed for spectacle but for the recognition that life thrives when attentiveness and understanding guide action. Over the decades, the guardian's presence became inseparable from the identity of the valley itself. The final chapter of the Vinland narrative is not a conclusion but a reflection on the enduring resonance of human curiosity, imagination, and the desire to explore beyond known boundaries. The story of the Norse voyages reminds us that discovery is never a straightforward act of charting land or claiming territory. It is a deeply human process, one that intertwines observation, adaptation, and storytelling. Across the North Atlantic, centuries ago, small ships braved storms, ice, and unpredictable currents, guided by intuition, experience, and a profound understanding of natural signs. The men and women who embarked on these journeys were pioneers not only of geography but of perception, courage, and endurance, embodying qualities that remain timeless and universally human. The settlements at Vinland, though temporary, reveal the Norse capacity for planning, adaptability, and cultural observation. At LanceEux Meadows, the longhouses, ironworking tools, and remnants of daily life speak to a society capable of surviving in an unfamiliar environment, balancing necessity with ingenuity. The settlers hunted, fished, gathered resources, and maintained their structures with care, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of both their immediate environment and the broader ecological system. These fleeting colonies, though ephemeral, offer enduring lessons about resilience, strategy, and the human capacity to learn quickly in new circumstances. They remind us that the measure of exploration is not solely permanence, but the ability to engage fully with uncertainty and opportunity alike. Encounters with the indigenous peoples of Vinland, known as the Skrælings, add profound depth to the narrative. The Norse navigated complex social interactions, negotiating trade, conflict, and coexistence without the benefit of shared language or long-standing alliances. These encounters required empathy, observation, and rapid learning, revealing that exploration is as much a psychological and social endeavor as it is a physical one. The interactions underscore a broader truth. Understanding the unknown often depends not only on the mastery of environment but on the ability to interpret and respond to the unfamiliar, whether it be people, terrain, or weather. The Vinland map, with its continuing controversy over authenticity, embodies the human drive to document, interpret, and transmit knowledge. Its delicate lines suggest coastlines and territories that may have existed in memory, imagination, or reality, reflecting the tension between recorded evidence and speculative insight. Whether genuine or a product of later fabrication, the map invites reflection on how humans construct knowledge, how they seek to preserve it, and how imagination and fact coexist in shaping history. It is a symbolic artifact, capturing the timeless impulse to map, record, and make sense of the unknown, an impulse as relevant today as it was in the Viking Age. The sagas complement this material record, preserving the experiences, emotions, and practical knowledge of the Norse voyages in vivid narrative form. These stories recount triumphs, dangers, hardships, and moments of wonder, offering insight into the psychological and cultural dimensions of exploration. They provide a bridge between generations, transmitting lessons of resilience, cooperation, and observation. Through these narratives, Vinland becomes more than a historical location. It becomes a symbol of human experience, a story of courage, intellect, and the complex interplay between curiosity and survival. The ephemeral nature of the settlements and the uncertainty surrounding artifacts and maps underscore an essential human truth. The impact of exploration is not solely measured by conquest or permanence, but by the knowledge gained, the stories preserved, and the inspiration generated. The Norse presence in Vinland, though brief, continues to spark debate, study, and imagination, demonstrating the enduring power of human curiosity and the resilience of narrative memory. Even transient actions, when observed, recorded, and reflected upon, can resonate across centuries, shaping understanding and inspiring new generations. Psychologically, the voyages exemplify the human capacity for courage, adaptability, and resilience in the face of uncertainty. The Norse sailors and settlers navigated unpredictable oceans, learned from encounters with unfamiliar peoples, and adapted to alien landscapes, relying on skill, observation, and collective intelligence. These qualities highlight that exploration is as much an internal endeavor, a test of perception, judgment, and resolve, as it is an external one. They remind us that human achievement often lies not in the scale of conquest but in the ability to engage thoughtfully and creatively with the unknown. Vinland, in all its complexity, also illustrates the interplay between fact, myth, and imagination in shaping historical understanding. The sagas, maps, and archaeological evidence together form a tapestry in which each element informs and enriches the others. This interplay demonstrates that history is not static. It is a dialogue across time between human experience, observation, and storytelling. Vinland exemplifies the dynamic nature of discovery, where knowledge, perception, and imagination converge to create a narrative that transcends the boundaries of empirical evidence alone. Ultimately, Vinland stands as a testament to the enduring qualities that define human exploration: curiosity, courage, observation, resilience, and imagination. The Norse voyages, the temporary settlements, the sagas, and the maps collectively illuminate the process by which humans engage with the unknown. They reveal that discovery is as much about observing, interpreting, and narrating as it is about reaching new lands. Vinland endures not because of empire or conquest, but because it embodies the timeless human drive to understand the world, to push beyond the familiar, and to leave traces of thought, courage, and curiosity for those who follow. In reflecting on Vinland, we recognize that exploration is both a physical and intellectual journey, one that connects generations through shared curiosity and imagination. The courage, ingenuity, and adaptability of the Norse resonate across time, reminding us that human history is as much about resilience, perception, and creativity as it is about events or dates. Their story invites us to engage with the unknown in our own lives, to observe carefully, learn deeply, and act boldly. Vinland is more than a place. It is a symbol of the human spirit, a celebration of curiosity, and a testament to the enduring power of exploration. The lessons of Vinland persist in the imagination, encouraging us to see history not as a static record but as a living dialogue, one that blends fact, interpretation, and wonder. The Norse voyages exemplify how even fleeting human actions can leave lasting impressions through narrative, observation, and memory. In contemplating Vinland, we honor not only the courage of those early explorers but also the qualities they exemplified: ingenuity, adaptability, and the persistent quest to understand what lies beyond the horizon. Their story endures, echoing through centuries as a reminder that exploration is an eternal human endeavor, guided by curiosity, sustained by courage, and enriched by the stories we tell to make sense of the world.